want to start with an exercise here where we think about a place in our lives or in our past or in our childhood or somewhere along the line where we experienced biodiversity. And maybe if you can come to a memory where there's a memory of some of the most biodiversity you can think of, just in this moment. If you need to close your eyes, and if you think of that time, and maybe some of the smells and the sounds, and what was around you, and if, as you think about this, if something comes to mind, a feature of this place, and you want to shout it out or share it with someone around you, I'd just be curious, and maybe everyone else would be curious to hear what was in that place. Here. Okay. Hedges? Yeah. Bamboo. Osprey. Okay. Cool. Yeah, so these places of biodiversity can impact our being, really, and create lasting memories and lasting experiences that can kind of shape us as humans. And so going to kind of share a little bit today with this concept that I've mainly been working on through the work with this woman, Dr. Florencia Montagnini, who, when I first met her 3 years ago, we had a great connection, and then I began working with her, and about the second time I came to her office, she was telling me, she said, we always talk about all these different ideas, and there's this one idea I've been thinking about for years, and it's this idea of biodiversity islands. Like this idea where there are islands within the landscape that are just have an enormous amount of biodiversity, and maybe we can expand on this and kind of work on this. So I would meet with her once a week, and we'd kind of explore the research, kind of supporting this idea. It's not a new idea. These things already exist, but it's just kind of creating a name for them. So biodiversity islands are areas of high biodiversity in ecologically degraded, human-dominated landscapes, right? So in places that already exist, like where there's vast landscapes of biodiversity, that kind of is maybe the future vision of humanity on the landscape realized, right? But in our current urban settings or agricultural settings, where there's a void of biodiversity, we feel that this framing tool can be a powerful thing. And so this is ecological refugia where plants, animals, and fungi can thrive without degenerative interference from human activity. And I'll go on that a little bit more, where it doesn't mean it's devoid of human activity. So that's an important component. And so another interesting way to frame it is that these places can be genetic, cultural, and carbon sequestering banks embedded within the landscape. And there was an interesting talk just now with Ronnie, who was discussing about how, if we bailed out the banks, right? If we viewed the environmental resources and wealth as banks, maybe we would treat them similarly. So I like that kind of framing standpoint. And so we felt in discussing this that this could be a valuable tool for practitioners, for policymakers, and really just for all humankind and their experiences in their day-to-day life. And they already exist. So, yeah, this idea of human interaction versus no human interaction is a really important component of conservation, and it actually has really tragic and very horrible history embedded within it. The creation of national parks, the creation of protected areas in the past and to present currently, even with a lot of, if you look at a lot of the carbon sequestering funds and all this stuff, in many instances, this is kicking people off of their lands where they've been practicing traditional ways, or this is where they're based and they're being kicked off for conservation efforts. So I think it's an important thing to recognize that this idea of completely being non-interactive with the landscape is, in certain instances, that may be appropriate, but for the most part, it's kind of an important aspect of what we do as being a human being is interacting with the world around us. So it's something to appreciate. Now, so what motivates the protection and the creation of biodiversity on a landscape or biodiversity islands? And in many ways, this could be motivated by the fact that we are, we are within the Anthropocene, that the movement of land and earth currently right now by humans is a greater force than the geologic forces. That was, to some people's perspective, the marking of entering into the Anthropocene. The fact that we're in a mass extinction, the fact that there's loss of traditional ecological knowledge, that's teak. The fact that there's food insecurity, climate change, all of these things. This has been talked about in a number of sessions here, but this trend that population growth, then intensification of agriculture leads to then forest fragmentation and a lack of landscape connectivity, which overall creates a loss of overall biodiversity. This is a trend we've seen over and over again throughout the world, and there are numbers of organizations that are rising up to do something about this, or that have stuck with their roots and have continued to do something about this. So I'm going to kind of dig into this environmental ethic a little bit more, just because that's something that interests me and may interest you. So there's, you can't really see on the end here, but I kind of view it in some ways as this kind of bizarre spectrum. It's not really linear, but so in many cultures, the conservation of biodiversity within a landscape is inherent within the culture. If you look at this, I mean, there's many examples, but this is one by Professor William Belay, and looking at the Kaapor people of Suriname, where actually within the landscape, he did plant inventories of where people habitated the landscape and where there were no people in the landscape. There was a greater amount of biodiversity within the landscape where people inhabited than the places where they did not. Thank you. I mean, I think that's something to just consider, that, the conservation of biodiversity may be, and in certain instances, is inherent within the culture itself. Now, in recent environmental times, we come to, you could start with the scientific, right? That the fact that we're going through a mass extinction, the fact that all these environmental calamities have taken place. We look at Rachel Carson, we look at a number of people's scientific work that then created this scientific consensus of, we need to do something about biodiversity loss. We need to do something about the way humans interact with the planet. You can also look at it from an ethical and philosophical perspective. Aldo Leopold in the Sand Colony Almanac is kind of touted as this great environmental book because it created the idea of a land ethic and protecting the landscape for its inherent values, not for anything beyond that. And that's a more modern thinking, and I think that kind of, both of those things create aspects of where it can become inherent within our culture to conserve biodiversity. And then we look more recently to the permaculture movement and what that has done, where it's kind of an integration of this land ethic and a scientific approach and a traditional approach, kind of all blended together into how can we live permanently within the landscape. And I think that's a very fascinating avenue to go as well. And they all kind of have connections with one another. And then another one that kind of integrates all of them, this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is just kind of this beautiful synthesis that really blends all of them together. And it written by an indigenous woman. So where can these exist? These can exist in any bioregion on public, private, and communal lands, really from the urban to rural spectrum, and within that, agricultural lands as well. So how do we do this from a biological perspective? So this is an important thing to look at, and understanding the underlying biogeography of a place is essential. And what that consists of is looking at the geology, the soils, the hydrology, and the biology. And I've bolded hydrology here, just focusing on this idea that water is life, right? That if there isn't water, then even if the previous geologic history has the perfect, and the soils have perfect conditions for there to be a harboring of great life, without the necessary hydrology, the biology basically cannot be available. To the side, I've included a couple interesting books and resources that touch on that in interesting ways. And so another interesting and important component is understanding the patch dynamics that exist within the landscape. So that's kind of the process of deforestation, of clearing the land from its original harboring of biology to its current place, right? And so this image on the right is kind of the very basic schematic of what patch dynamics looks like through time, right? Where there's a fully forested area and then it breaks up through time. And within that, I guess I'll go down to this single large or several smaller debate. So this idea that within patch dynamics, there was this long debate that went on, kind of saying, okay, we need to create reserves within the landscape, these protected areas within the landscape that are very large, and that's going to be the best harbor of biodiversity. And if we clear everything else, it's okay because it's that. And then other people said, no. The most important thing is that it's that there are these little patches all throughout, so there can be some connectivity, and that is the best avenue for conservation of biodiversity. And then in current literature, we're at this habitat amount hypothesis, where it's basically, it doesn't matter between the two as long as there's greater habitat. That's the most important factor, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's single large or several small. So another important consideration is looking at the site degradation, like how degraded is it, how much human energy needs to go in, or also how much, like maybe just letting it be fallow can allow for biodiversity to reemerge. And that can be done also through an analysis of the current species that exist within that place. When I first talked with Florencia about this stuff, we were kind of building off this theory of island biogeography, which was devised by E.O. Wilson and MacArthur, and it's this idea that speciation through time is related to the island size. Well, and when they were looking at this was literal islands in the ocean, right? They were looking at different islands, and they were trying to understand, how do species come, how do species go extinct on those islands, how do species leave those islands? And so this correlation between the island size, the distance from other islands, and the method of dispersal and immigration is crucial to understanding how biodiversity and how species will persist through time. And an interesting research project within that is this one that's called the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments project that's taken place in Brazil over the last 40 years, where basically, I don't know how I feel about it, because they basically have this huge tract of forest that then they've been chopping down sections and making different patches to begin to understand how patch dynamics take place. So it's like, I don't know, maybe a little more damage done than, the information they're getting out of it, but I don't know. So going beyond this is, okay, so you want to create a biodiversity island. You want to create a place of great diversity, biodiversity on the landscape. That will take enrichment planting, which is, a term of, planting trees, planting plants, that kind of thing. And there's, a whole bunch of information and tactics that go within that. So there's an interesting thought that, regenerative agricultural systems in and of themselves can act as biodiversity islands within the landscape. And this is just kind of the inherent nature of what a regenerative agriculture system is. Here we have Sepp Holzer and the Krameterhof, amazing farm in the Austrian Alps that has 80 plus little small ponds and all sorts of beautiful things. If you haven't looked his stuff up, he's an amazing person. Or Mark Shepard's farm, New Forest Farm, and the work of agroecology, Miguel Altieri, who was here last night, and the work of Vandana Shiva, and also her seed saving, and just the integration of many, many, many different species of crops onto a farm in and of itself can create a biodiversity island within the landscape. We've all probably been to these places and recognized them as, beautiful places we've seen and felt and experienced. And so, yeah, our idea in just coining this term or whatever was just to put another name to it to help in its promotion. Oh, and going back, this chart on the bottom right, this fixed cost per unit versus units produced, seems to be one of the main kind of lenses from the modern economist that is prohibitive to the development of these types of systems, right? So when you're trying to get the unit of production at its bare minimum, the diversity of the system in and of itself, in many instances, it becomes the lowest common denominator is a monoculture in that. So that seems to be the antithesis of these types of systems. So another thing I want to touch on, because I've worked with Ron and Jan here for a little bit, and I respect their work and I've worked with them on the Dietrich Institute, which is a nonprofit affiliated with their company, Rincon Vitova Insectaries. And so they promote biological control for pest management, and there's a nonprofit affiliated with it, which is the Dietrich Institute. And so Jan's father, who's Everett Dietrich, he was kind of a visionary when it comes to biological control. And he had his 5 features of integrated pest management. One of them, which was the creation of habitat for beneficial insects, and it's also for the pests. So there's something for the beneficial insects to eat on. And so this is kind of some information on that work and the promotion of these diverse beneficial insectary plants and insectary hedgerows within farm systems that have a number of benefits inherent within them. So digging into this a little bit more, we have insectary plants mainly from the Apiaceae family, which I guess was recently switched from Umbrella, blah blah blah. But it's the umbel inflorescence that are really what the insects are going after. It's the pollen source. It's the flowers that kind of spread out and have hundreds or thousands of flowers within the flower structure. And another avenue to go is through insectary hedgerows to create banker plants. Beetle banks, these grasses that are protected that allow for beetles to go to. So even when you're doing intensive work on the field, that the beetles can come back out and repopulate companion planting and cover cropping, which is all stuff we've heard about and we're familiar with, but these all can add diversity to the agricultural system and create it as a biodiversity island. So these are some of the more common insectary plants that we see and plant and can plant. And so this is just a little more on hedgerows. This is from UC Davis information on creating hedgerows. I'm not going to go into all this, but they provide the benefits that I was previously mentioning. If you want to go into this further, I can send you these slides and we can go from there. So another component that I want to talk on that has really fascinated me and the work between myself and Florencia has been this idea of agroforestry systems as biodiversity islands within a landscape. So a lot of these slides are taken from a presentation that Florencia gave a year ago, and it's actually, I gave another kind of side presentation and blended them together, so I just wanted to give her credit and for the contribution of this work. So what are agroforestry systems? We've probably talked on it, or you may know, or you may not, but so it's intensive land management, and it optimizes the benefits from biological interactions created when trees and or shrubs are deliberately combined with crops and or livestock. So these are intentional, intensive, interactive, and integrated. And the main types of agroforestry systems we find throughout the world are forest gardens or multi-strata home gardens, complementary systems, which include living fences, windbreaks, and riparian buffer zones, alley cropping, which is having the trees and then the crops beside them in an organized and spaced fashion, normally for farm equipment to go through. Silvopasture systems, which is the integration of livestock. It can be within an alley cropping system or within a more forested landscape. And also forest farming, where the forest remains predominantly intact, but you are planting other types of crops within the forest or harvesting something out of the forest, something like maple syrup, maybe consider that, or as we have here, we have ramp production, or we could do ginger or golden seal, something along those lines. So, how do they help protect and conserve biodiversity, agroforestry systems? They provide habitats and niches for other species. They serve as perches and nesting sites, provide food resources, improve local microclimates, and they serve as sites for seed deposition and germination. They act as buffer zones, and they can act as buffer zones to larger protected areas. This is another thing that we discussed that I think is really fascinating, where, okay, so say there's a region that someone, and this may be debated, maybe there shouldn't be any human interaction. But leading up to that system, there can be an agroforestry component where it's kind of this segue into that, where it's an integration of these food-producing trees. And another interesting component is that agroforestry systems have been found to act as biological corridors for biodiversity among the landscape. So in designing agroforestry systems, it's best to include several tree species, use native species, keep at least 40% shade year-round, maintain at least 12 to 15 meters of canopy height, and create different tree strata. Allow the growth of epiphytes, lianas, which are like vines, and other plants on shade trees. Leave dead branches and stumps for decomposition and fungal growth. Have live fences, tree hedges, shrubs, and natural secondary vegetation on the farm. And it's to minimize and eventually or completely eliminate the use of agrochemicals and minimize tree pruning within these systems. So these are a couple photos of multi-strata agroforestry systems found throughout Central and South America. And worldwide, there are about 1 billion hectares of agroforestry systems, which is a really impressive number. And many of those are actually within the multi-strata home gardens of people throughout the world. Another interesting note on that is like when we talk about the fact that the areas around the equator are the centers where the greatest carbon sequestration is going to have to take place just due to the inherent potential of that landscape. That's an important thing to consider, that these carbon sequestering systems can also be producing food and a haven for biodiversity within the landscape. The most frequent agroforestry systems are multi-strata and alley cropping, silvopasture, and complementary systems. So these are just more photos of some living fences and windbreaks and a riparian buffer, which, you know, that's the buffer of trees prior to the river that can collect any runoff that there may be from the farm. So something I'm going to go a little more into is this incorporation of living fences and how they create an increase in landscape connectivity of biodiversity. Their principal role is to divide, separate, and protect against agricultural plots and cattle. Basically, it's a fence. It's a fence that's a tree, and you just plant them. And you can, in certain climates, you can even just put sticks in the ground, and they'll begin to germinate roots and grow up. And so they can also provide fuel wood, fruits, fodder, and shade for cattle through time, and they promote biodiversity. Florencia did a couple-year study of studying biodiversity interactions or species interactions with living fences and found that there was a correlation between landscape connectivity of certain species and the implementation of living fences, which I think is a pretty fascinating conclusion. Some of the characteristics when we're looking at a living fence is allowing for there to be a large crown diameter. When I say crown diameter, it's the crown of the tree. That's the uppermost portion of the tree. And allowing for the trees to maintain good height and grow to a good height. Allowing for the trunk to grow to a good height as well. And through time for there to be a large DBH, diameter at breast height. That's a kind of standard measure of trees. And to increase the number of trees through time is a good thing. So yeah, this is kind of going on the same thing. This is a really pretty easy and useful approach to promoting landscape connectivity and creating a biodiversity island within a landscape on a farm that can, you know, save you time and money and provide resources. So another component of this is that many traditional and low-intensive management multi-strata agroforestry systems exist, and they really have the potential to harbor the greatest amount of biodiversity within the landscape. And the contribution of agroforestry systems to biodiversity on a landscape is completely dependent on the type of agroforestry system that it is. So in going into this a little bit more, you can really utilize a number of silvicultural approaches to management for agroforestry systems. And silviculture is basically forest management. It's the art and science of forest management is how it's described. And so if we understand basically, you can look at a forest system or an agroforestry system and look at the species that are present and look at how they, and understand how they will develop through time. And basically through time there will be crown differentiation, which will create different crown classes. There will be dominant, co-dominant, and overtopped, and intermediate. Those are the different letters there. The overtop species through time will begin to die off just due to the lack of resources of light. So if you can plan your system with that in mind, it can allow for the system to persist well into time. And also in understanding this, it's important to understand stand dynamics, which is basically kind of what I was describing previously, which is it's the maturity of forests through time after a disturbance event. So for instance, say there is a landslide on a forest, right? And there's some seed bank that's within the ground. How is that going to emerge through time? So first there's going to be stand initiation. That's going to be the stand is just the cohort of species that are there that have all kind of taken off at the exact same time. That's the stand. And the initiation is their initial emergence from the ground. Through time, there will be stem exclusion, and that's what we're seeing over there on the right, where some of the species will begin to die off, some will become dominant, some will become overtopped. In this time, as a manager, as a land manager, it's important to recognize and ensure that understory reinitiation is taking place. And what that means is that it's basically that the next cohort of stand initiation has emerged below the existing crown, right? And how that's done typically as a manager is you have to cut some trees that would otherwise basically die through being overtopped, to allow for there to be some light penetration through the canopy to allow for the next cohort of species to take place. And if you do that and you allow for these to, rot and fungus to take them over, or you build a bench or something out of that, that's cool. What's that? That's Florencia Montagnini and Mark Ashton. So yeah, that's kind of what we're getting at here. And this is the thing in the bottom corner you can't really see is just understanding the even-aged stratified mixture. So then through time, you can also plant different strata of species within the same cohort, or seed it for a multi-strata system that allows for there to be, the very tall species, the intermediate species, and the lower shrubs, brushes, and annuals. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you just look up, you Google stand dynamics, that's it. What you will find if you do that is forestry papers, right? This is like a forestry practice, right? And taught at forestry schools all over the world. The kind of different angle that's coming at it through this is, okay, how is that applied to an agroforestry system? Fruit and nut and, bearing trees, that kind of thing. So, so there are many multi-strata agroforestry systems that use traditional ecological knowledge to mimic natural forests and successional patterns. And that's a really interesting avenue to go down as well. These are found all throughout South and Central America, and also here in the United States and beyond. So these are just some examples. If you're interested in learning more about this, some of these organizations are the Society of Ethnobiology is really fascinating, and there's tons of resources and people connected with that. Milpas System, which was basically a Swidden system where people would come in and burn the landscape, but then allow for a mature food-bearing forest to emerge and an annual production system only for a set number of years, and then let it go fallow for a number of years before returning to it again. And so there are countless different approaches. This one, Tending the Wild, you're probably familiar with that book. We're looking at these types of systems within California landscape. So another component of Florencia's research was looking at these multi-strata home gardens as biological corridors for different bird species through Central America, and it was found basically that home gardens, that's the HG on the right, harbored some of the most biodiverse avian life of anywhere on the landscape. So that's I think something worth noting and recognizing that that we as humans and the creation of our food production systems can create these biological corridors on the landscape as a whole. So how do we do this, right? Well, I guess we're already doing it, many of us, and many people are already doing this, and that's it. And education and political will and political engagement are very important components. This comes from a local, regional, national, and international level. Another interesting avenue, particularly within the United States, is the utilization of conservation easements, in my opinion, because and the idea of working lands conservation easements, where you can conserve a land, and within the legal framework of those conservation easements, you can add basically whatever you want, where to ensure the security of this biodiversity through time can be a tenet of those legal agreements, and that's basically where a landowner agrees to not do that and typically gets some sort of financial reimbursement in response, but not necessarily. So another interesting approach is this idea of integrated landscape management, which is this phrase that's been tossed around a whole lot that I've seen over the last couple of years, where it's this idea of, all right, we're looking at from a landscape approach, right? How are we going to create management on a landscape approach? And it includes bringing together various stakeholders and various people from various walks of life to have input on how the land will be managed within a particular watershed or region or something of that nature. And within all of this, I also just want to emphasize that inclusion and accessibility and addressing social inequality and respecting and empowering traditional and indigenous ways is essential and crucial to all of this. I saw the panel earlier and hearing Canyon talk earlier, and many of the interactions I've had that have shaped my perspective on this. It just feels like something that it is essential to the development of any of these types of systems. So how, in terms of governance, this is eight kind of ideas that came from Eleanor Ostrom, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, I just really like these 8 principles for governing common land. And she wrote this book called Governing the Commons, which kind of goes into all of these more, but it was kind of in a reaction to this idea that there's a tragedy of the commons, that any common space that may exist, there's going to be this, fight for resources, and humans are inherently going to just battle it out, and it'll all, the sheep pasture will go will go to nothing through time because of humans' inability to cooperate, and therefore we need to just hunker down in our own, walled yards. And this is kind of a contrary to that. Some other different books and approaches. We could look down our southern neighbors in the Zapatista movement, and some of these books are really interesting, particularly the We the People. If you're interested in this stuff, worth jotting that one down. Oops. So, just out of curiosity, I want to hear of any places in your life or on your farm or anything like that where an increased amount of biodiversity may exist. Or if you want to just think on it or shout it out or share. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. That's debatable. It seems if native species can do the job, that would be appropriate. If they're, sometimes, you want to eat whatever, you want to eat. Yeah, yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it seems to be a preference, but not imperative, right? And I think there is concern too from the native species perspective that it can basically stunt successional processes of the ecosystem surrounding if it is released, right? There's all sorts of examples of that throughout the Northeast and all over, but there's also this idea that, okay, well, it happened, and there's, it's been something that's been happening on Earth for eons, right? So, and then another ecosystem will come, and so I see both sides. What I don't see and what I don't understand is, that there's then this chemical industry that, emerges through combating this and is degrading the ecosystem to an even greater extent and poisoning people through that. But that's kind of a side, Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, for instance, in the Northeast, there's Japanese knotweed out there. There's a number of them that will come in and basically create a mat over the forest floor where it's, you know, and what I was talking about before with that successional process, that understory reinitiation has a very difficult time taking place naturally within that system. And as trees then begin to fall, it's then just becomes just that. Granted, a lot of these then are medicinal and provide edible food and all this stuff, and it's like, you know, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. I don't know. Yep. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean there's that's yeah. Well, and it's also it's your situation. I don't know. I mean, you know, there's a number. You know, you can do raised beds and that kind of thing if that in that context, and have some matting below to prevent the roots from coming up. But within these types of multi-strata home garden agroforestry systems, um, typically there's enough basically that's dying off or that can be managed that creates enough soil through time that, and I guess there can be a harmonious interaction of root systems within these types of systems that it's not all one or none. It can be a more harmonious interaction of species. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 So, how much of this idea is just for maintaining the routes for insects and species that are migrating? And I guess it's more just it's that isn't a byproduct of the creation of these systems, right? So it's just, I mean, if that's what your focus wants to be, then so that's what it is, yeah. And then you get food and also, which is nice. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. 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 And eat it. Yeah. 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 Mhm. Uh-huh. Yeah. 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 Well, I think that's a really interesting, thought that just by us doing nothing, that in and of itself can allow for biodiversity to reemerge in a place. Initially, when we were discussing this concept, we were saying, okay, areas, protected areas, right? Biodiversity islands, protected areas in human-dominated landscapes. But then we discussed it further, and it's like, well, that might be one avenue and one approach, and maybe the easiest approach, where it's like, okay, but this integration of human energy into this space is another really important avenue. And like I was saying before, it can also allow for the empowerment of traditional ecological knowledge and traditional people and food systems, because it might not necessarily create food in that. I mean, it very well may, but so these are some really interesting examples of community forest management and agricultural management that I've kind of been following. And yeah, if you want these slides, I'm happy to share with you. So another avenue and an interesting thing to look at within all this is examples. Did you have a question, Jan? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. I'll talk. Yeah. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. No, no. Yeah. Um, so another interesting avenue of looking at this and is okay. So where in human dominated landscapes where there's been an enormous amount of degradation of biodiversity, where through time have pockets of biodiversity persisted through time. And another example of this that's a lot older than the more renewed urban agricultural spaces of recent are in religious and spiritual sites throughout the world. And so all throughout India, there are these sacred groves, these places around monastery or traditional monasteries out there where species are protected and biodiversity has persisted. And You find these globally throughout the world, actually. If this is just another example in central Benin, where there are sacred pools along the rivers protected by Chichabe people, and where there's been degradation all throughout, but these areas are protected on the landscape. And this also goes back to these kind of the motivations being that it's just inherent within the culture, and I think that's maybe something for our culture to strive for, and a lot of maybe the reason we're here and what we're working on. So, sacred cacao groves of the Maya as well, similar story. And in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Ghana, Thailand, China, Nepal, these are found all over. And there's a lot of resources there. So in rural locations, there's a whole bunch of different avenues that these types of things are taking place, a whole bunch of organizations working towards this. There's a friend who spent a number of months researching the development of agricultural systems in Ethiopia, northern Ethiopia, where there's been this kind of community movement to basically just band together and start building swales and creating these integrated agroforestry systems, just because they recognized that it made sense for their communities. And there wasn't really any exchange of payment within this. It was just kind of like, oh, this is what we need to do, so we're going to do it. And they just did it. And then they had a good time doing it in certain instances. In certain instances, it actually was pretty bad, and there was all these social dynamics that she discusses in some of her work. But on the bright side, that's a good thing. And that's actually so John D. Liu, who's been mentioned a couple times here, who I guess helped foster the idea of ecosystem restoration camps. It seems like that's a similar vision that he holds for those types of systems, where it's people coming together to restore the ecosystem, that no permission is needed, and maybe you can have a good time doing it in the process, right? So bunch of different examples globally where degraded landscapes are developed to harbor greater amounts of biodiversity through human efforts or non-human efforts. In the suburban setting, I was focusing more on, you could look at tropical home gardens and the multi-strata agroforestry systems globally that are outside of cities, and those harbor an enormous amount of biodiversity. But I was looking mainly at the suburban lens, North American style, right? Or, in this picture, it's Germany, where they had allotment gardens that have allowed for a greater amount of biodiversity and plant diversity to flourish. Right near us in Davis, there's Village Homes that was developed in, was it the 80s? And I guess it kind of became illegal to some extent after that, but it seems to be a really interesting avenue of human interaction with the landscape, human home building on the landscape. These different eco-villages and the Eco-Village Network is a great resource if you're interested in that. And then some really cool business opportunities. And one of the most shining examples of that is also a company that's not too far from here, Permaculture Artisans, Eric Olson's business, where they've been transforming suburban home landscapes into these beautiful food-producing, biodiverse landscapes. And they've been employing people along the way, and training people along the way. So that seems like it makes a lot of sense, right? And then the urban setting. Someone spoke from Planting Justice earlier, and I just want to say I have the most respect for their work and what they're doing, and it just seems to be hitting just such a nodal point of society and inspiring so many people and so many things along the way. This book on the upper right, it's a little bit cut off, but called Paradise Lot. Eric Tonesmeyer, who I had the gift of working with a little bit over this last year, and got to visit his home plot, which is on 1/10 of an acre, and he has, his last count was 267 perennial species on his 1/10 of an acre, and it's just a beautiful, it's really like a symphony of plants that they're, you know, in spring, like the first week of spring, there'll be the first flush, and then they'll kind of die back, and the next week another species will come up and be the dominant one, and then it's just this amazing thing. So that's a really cool book that he talks about, and it's like a pun on Paradise Lost. And then Place, which is also close by to here, biodiverse and beautiful and amazing. And then just these urban farming ventures and movements that have taken over all over the world and throughout the States. It's beautiful. This is a group from Philly Earth. It was a group I worked with a little bit in Philadelphia back a number of years back, but they're affiliated with this other organization called the Village of Arts and Humanity. That is probably one of the most beautiful community organizations I've ever encountered. They're in North Philadelphia. Ron Finley and his stuff. And this is another interesting kind of, the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity is this kind of rating system of how biodiverse a city is, and something kind of cool to scope out and look at if you're interested. But there's also, like, these aren't siloed things, right? There's a connection between the rural, the suburban, and the urban. And you know, in my vision, right? If you know, the greater human experience can be achieved, they will all be biological corridors, and Earth in and of itself is this inherent, and it already is, and it already was, biodiversity island within the planetary, the cosmos that we exist within. A really fascinating kind of side note. I don't know if you've ever encountered the book, The Biochar Revolution by Albert Bates, but he kind of closes the book kind of with that concept in mind. And he talks about how there are these thermal updrafts of air that have an enormous amount of bacteria within them, but also fungal spores that can withstand enormous heat and cold and basically survive within the vacuum of space. And that these are continually billowing from Earth into the cosmos, right? So the Earth in and of itself is seeding the cosmos with life. And so that was called The Biochar Revolution by Albert Bates. So I think that's a really kind of cool and interesting concept. And you know, if our work as humans, you know, fortifies that that seeding, I think that seems like a good use of energy. So just some nonprofit advocates that are out there doing this kind of work. As I mentioned, I've worked with the Dietrich Institute, and I really appreciate everything that they support. And I don't know if there's any questions on any of these. CPOV is doing a lot of work through South America and Central America if you're interested in the silvo pastoral system. IUFRO that was the conference that we presented some of this stuff on last year, and actually in a few weeks, it's the International Union of Forest Research Organizations, and they are actually having their World Congress that's taking place in Brazil in a few weeks. It'll be about 3,000 forest researchers going into Brazil. It'll probably be a pretty interesting event given the political climate right now. The World Agroforestry Center, Yeah, so because it has to do with there's kind of a connection and correlation between how money infiltrates the political system and how the diversion of human energy into the development of these systems, right? So, and then also just how workplaces are structured and their the inability for certain workplaces to fully allow for human potential to be realized, which actually is transitions well to the next slide, so there's also avenues to do this in a for-profit setting. I had mentioned permaculture artisans previously, but the for-profit company, Rincon Vitova, inherent within the business model is a respect for biodiversity, right? And there are numbers of examples of this, and I really think through time there will be no other option in business, that this is the only way to do business, because the negative social costs of all of this have really gone through the roof. So a little side note, back in 2016, I nominated Rincon Vitova for the Global Regenerative Business Prize, which is a prize put on by Carol Sanford, and they ended up winning, and that was an amazing thing and really cool. And so that's all about kind of empowering and lifting up organizations to maximize the human potential of each individual within the organization. And there's actually the connection that if that potential is maximized, then actually a greater environmental benefit and a regenerative outcome of the organization will and can be realized, which I think is just pretty cool. These are some really interesting companies as well, worth looking into more if you're into like the for-profit side of things. Lime Timber Company is developing funds and developing conservation easements within them to manage forests in biodiverse, friendly-ish ways. Worth looking at. And Symbiosis Investmentos is actually in the Atlantic rainforest, which talked about previously, but they're finding these beautiful mother trees and basically collecting the seeds, growing them out, and planting out these diverse forestry systems for timber products through time. And I can't fully advocate for them because I don't really know exactly the details, but that's what it sounds good on the surface at least. So an evergreen cooperative doing very interesting things, worth looking them up to if you're interested. Runa as well, empowering multi-strata home gardens for the development of, well, they do all sorts of crops, but guayusa is one of the main yields, which is a similar to mate. So, well, I only have 2 minutes, so these are some of the conclusions that, this idea of biodiversity islands, these islands of increased biodiversity on a degraded landscape, can be an interesting framing tool and an educational tool for policymakers, and also just for our own optimism, I would say, in looking at the landscape and saying, wow, this is really a pocket of a place where life thrives. And one other thing I actually want to bring up within that is with Rincon Vitova, so the business itself is doing very cool things, but they are located on an oil field, right, that is surrounded by just complete degradation. And if you look at a map of that place, it's this green spot on the landscape, right? So that is just the prime example of this integration of all of these components. So there are systemic instruments and legal tools that can be used. Really awesome governance that includes all all people in the process. There are numerous examples of religious and spiritual sites throughout the world which embrace this, and there are many nonprofit and for-profit organizations that hold the power for further development of community-led action for biodiversity conservation. More information. Oh, and there's a website if you want more resources, biodiversityislands.wordpress.com, if you're interested. Thank you.